So I want to first thank you for inviting me to come here and talk to you about my work. That's such a pleasure, and I've really enjoyed so far hearing everybody else's work, and I'm going to try to make some connections now with my own work and the kinds of things, the papers I've been reading and what we've been talking about this morning. So my talk is on the global and local commons, emergent institutions from residual property forms. So I'll explain the title a little bit as we go along, but I just want to begin by saying that my interest in commons, global and local, really comes from a interest that I've had for a long time in a certain part of the spatial imaginary of modernity, which is empty space. And so that kind of came at a later time, because at first my original work was in Hungary, and I did field work looking at the transformation from socialism into capitalism. I also did work with Native American tribes in Minnesota around repatriation and also around land claim cases. So I'm very interested in those kinds of property forms that are what I'm going to call here residual, that persist within modernity. And if I can think of, this is the kind of Raymond Williams formulation, historical formulation of dominant, emergent, residual. So the idea that within the dominant form, property forms, of which I think the common property and the global commons have at their core a kind of spatial imaginary of empty space. So within that dominant form, there persists these residual forms that are claiming recognition, and again, within the dominant, emergent institutions. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. All right, so I'm just going to start with this idea of empty space. This is something that many sociologists, anthropologists, and others have talked about within modernity, this particular problematic. So I'm just going to read this. This is from Anthony Giddens. Only with the coming of modernity and as an absolutely integral element of that development did time and space become both universalized and integrated with the day-to-day activities of everyone. As I would express this phenomena, space and time became empty categories, specifically separated from one another as distinct dimensions of existence. So far as social life goes, the universal global map and the intervals on the face of the mechanical clock are the most cogent expressions of the emptying of time and space. Once time and space have become emptied and disengaged, they can be systematically reappropriated, most significantly in the shape of disembedded social relations of indefinite time-space extension. So that's kind of a mouthful, but that's kind of the philosophical premise out of which I'm working, that this is a kind of key spatial form of modernity that we deal with, and that it exists within our property forms. So what I want to say is that we're also familiar with empty space as a geographical imaginary of European expansion. So juridically, this has been expressed in the doctrine of colonial sovereignty called terra nullius, and also land belonging to no one. This doctrine was used by European states to declare large areas of the inhabited earth in Africa, the Americas, Australia, and Antarctic as spaces empty of recognizable political organization, and therefore open to occupation and possession. What's often not recognized is that this form of terra nullius is also part of the basis of the organization of global commons. So let me first just talk about empty space as a kind of cultural machine. Besides what Giddens talked about in terms of the mapping of modernity, empty space is also a kind of optical machine to reproduce the world through a one-point perspective. And I kind of use this image as a way of thinking of the kind of capturing of reality and then the reproduction of it within a gridded kind of representational form. So the first book that I dealt with really tried to look at empty space as this kind of cultural machine. And I first looked at it in terms of common space or public space in cities. So this book on empty space as a felt experience, I did a cultural history of the pathology of agoraphobia, which is fear of large open spaces in cities that kind of emerged in European cities. In Berlin in particular was first noted, where people, when they were starting to build these giant spaces, let's see, here's the image of them. Here's the first noted instance of agoraphobia was in this particular Platz, Domhofplatz in Berlin. So it's cases started to appear for psychologists that were men in particular trying to walk through these spaces. They would have panic attacks and not be able to cross over the spaces. They would have to retreat. Oftentimes they would get halfway through exactly and have to come back. So there was a cultural logic to the illness, and what I was looking at was the treatment of this over time. So how did this, I looked at a number of journals and looked at and kind of cross-referenced that to what was happening in urban design, how public space itself was appearing as these sites of fear for modern urban subjects. So starting from the 1870s and then up until today, the key sites that kept appearing for this illness were the mall, the shopping mall, and the urban freeway. And these sites are part of course, the emptiness of these sites and the kind of lack of social relations that kind of disappear in urban space with them. Here's kind of a easier way to see that. This is the city of Brasilia. First, this is a city nearby, Parma, in 1830, and you can see that the black there is the way the city was structured in 1830. In 1960, when it was kind of redone as a modern city in Brasilia, the white is the empty space and the black is the urban space. So the way in which we as urban citizens have had to learn to become comfortable with urban freeways and with this kind of thing. Was my concern in the book, and my argument was that we could learn from the way those who felt extreme anxiety in these places, how they were treated in order to become normalized and to be able to enter in these spaces. So these kinds of treatments included up until into the 1940s and 50s, where it became mostly a disorder for women. And this was in Europe, and especially England and the United States. There were many lobotomies that were performed for this illness. And then after the 1980s, beta blockers and other things. But and then more recently, kind of more interesting kinds of treatments that were understanding the social anxiety really as a problem of the space itself. So I also found several case histories that were about kind of what was happening at the end of these big freeways. So in housing projects where people were being moved and dislocated into these really large spaces, when they were displaced from their neighborhoods, what was happening, how agoraphobia manifests there, and then how they were treated for it. The kind of last image of the urban commons I used to talk about the new kinds of treatments were these kind of new urbanism spaces where you take a space like this, a public space, and turn it into so the center space into a space that's where pedestrians and cars and others share the space, and they use a signage like this to show that the space is being shared. And so it's not a homogeneous space for a particular function, but this shared space. And the idea was that this had been identified as a kind of pathology, both by urban planners and by psychologists who were treating agoraphobia. So this kind of more general idea about commons and urban commons was what led me then into also considering how other kinds of common space, the creation of common space through law, was also related to and had at the bottom this epistemic imaginary, spatial imaginary of empty space. And so that is the topic of my second book, which I think some of you were reading for this course. And this Commons kind of begins with thinking about the Roman system of property. So these kind of four key categories of property: res communis, which is also common property; public property; property res nullius, property that belongs to no one; objects, in other words, with no property rights attached, either because they're abandoned or not yet acquired; and then res private, or res nullius. The other category here that is often not mentioned is this category of things that belong to the gods, which I often found overlaps then with the category of things that belong to everyone. So what I did here was I looked at a number of treatises on international law to looked at the development of the of international law on the global commons, and I'm going to find myself in here. Okay, and right. So excuse me, I'm going to kind of go back for a minute here. So what's important here then is that within these categories is that today really domains of the earth that make up the global commons here are in fact in a category that really overlaps with the category of empty space or res nullius, space that belongs to no one. So this idea that things that belong to no one are the same as things that belong to everyone. I try to look at that paradoxical logic and how it's working itself out. The regions of the global commons in international law include the high seas, the atmosphere, outer space, radio frequencies, and then most recently the biodiversity of the gene pool. All of these domains that lie outside of the Earth's territorial nation states. So in practice, they're treated as res nullius, even though they're legally recognized as res communis, things that belong to everyone. These commons, then domains, they belong to all the Earth's citizens, theoretically, and yet in international law, we don't have any success really in protecting them from further privatization and from the continuing dispossession of the Earth, and that was really what was driving me to look at that in this book. Cultural geographers often point to how regional metaphors help form our sense of place. And I would say that the regional metaphor then for the global commons today is empty space. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about empty space then as this kind of epistemological structure of modern science, and kind of begin with this particular domain of the global commons, which is the biodiversity. It's interesting that the French sociologist Bruno Latour argued that modern science has had a large role to play in the creation of this kind of empty space. He laid out an argument for a new political ecology by saying that, by that science itself had falsely claiming that nature as a realm of life, that empty of society's normative or cultural inscriptions. So the idea that science itself, from this kind of design or this visualization, where we'd study the entity in itself, just as a discrete object, without its, embedded in social relationships. And for Latour, this was a way of kind of leading to an idea of science working with nature as something that did not have due process involved and could not access it. The second image here is from an advertisement that Monsanto took out in 1996 for a show on biodiversity at the Museum of Modern History, and it was in the New York Times, a full-page ad. We believe in equal opportunity regardless of race, creed, gender, kingdom, phylum, class, etc. But I use this design because the usefulness for thinking about genetic material as a kind of commons, and the idea that science gives us a description of nature, which comes in terms of genetic code, and that the law itself then considers biodiversity as genetic material, which is basically looking at and protecting it in terms of genetic code. And I think that this also we can find this particular kind of argument also in visual material like this, even in popular culture. So these kind of persistent legacies of empty space that endure in the global commons kind of go back to, in many kinds of legal frameworks. One is the vacuum domicilium, this 17th century American colonial idea. If I want to see, this is the kind of neoclassical economic theory that viewed nature as a God-given open access domain. The idea that as long as the free market had open access to what it saw as an unlimited supply of nature's resources, then this would balance the interests of social welfare in and of itself. This domicilium vacantis argument uses the same kind of spatial logic as that other well-known argument made by John Locke, namely that all human beings start out in life as a tabula rasa, kind of blank slate upon which society could later write codes of appropriate personhood. So I think that just as this kind of empty space was used to explain why European conventions of civility and reason could successfully be inscribed on non-European minds, just as it was used to excuse the taking of indigenous lands, in short, just as it was used to further colonial enterprise, the metaphor of empty space was also used to underwrite legal descriptions of the global commons, beginning with the so-called father of international law, the Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius, who wrote the template for future global commons in his work Mare Liberum, the Law of the Open Seas. So empty space then has this legal kind of conceptual operation in modernity, and that was the key argument in my book. So articulating then this kind of distinctions between the modern global commons, res nullius, terra nullius, and res communis. This is a quote from Jonathan Vogler's The Global Commons. And here he's trying to distinguish what is open access in the global commons. And I think I chose this quote because I want you to be able to see the ambiguity, or the kind of contradiction that exists here spatially, as he's trying to point out to us why the global commons is open access, but it's not the same as res nullius. The original characteristics of a commons, he says, is open access. It's available for use by anybody, and its goods are non-excludable and free for the taking. A commonly used legal description is res nullius, literally the property of no one. This does not imply that, like undiscovered land, terra nullius, during the great age of maritime exploration, the right to exclusive use of such resources could be seized. In international law, this is avoided under the doctrine of common property, res communis. For over 100 years, this has been applied to the fish and the mammals of the high seas, where no single user can have exclusive rights to them, nor the right to prevent others from joining in their exploitation. So I think a close reading of this, where he's trying to distinguish these two, res nullius, it's kind of like terra nullius. At the same time, we save it from becoming terra nullius because it's actually res communis. And in fact, at other times in the book, Volcker himself just laments straight out, the state of nature for the global commons is res nullius. And this is something that you find over and over. You protect the attempts to, and we saw this in many of the papers that were looking at fisheries and beginning of industrialized fishing, the use of these as the seas and fish, not as res communis, but in fact as res nullius. So, the important thing that I want to emphasize here is that by creating a new notion of commons that comes from the visual, homogeneous aspect of the seas, Grotius was also creating a new notion of user rights in unrestricted domains of unbelonging. This is indeed an extension of the Roman doctrine of res nullius and res communis into the seas, but it really leaves out that important doctrine of Roman property that balances the cosmological system of Roman law, which is the doctrine of res divini juris, the category of things and spaces of divine jurisdictions, things that are unownable because of their divine or sacred status. So with that kind of cosmological order dropped out, we have this category of things belonging to nobody and everyone. Again, the complete collapse of the world's fisheries in the last few decades is the best argument against this kind of thinking, but really currently this is how international law of the global commons works with regard to the high seas. The other thing is that global commons are also often talked about in terms of that kind of more rationalized vocabulary of common pool resources, where you speak of a system's inherent properties of exclusion or subtractability. Here again, this is where cultural studies scholars and anthropologists kind of come in and show the conceptual problems of this new kind of rational language by showing how the old Latin concepts themselves, with these kind of clear reminders of the rhetorical image of empty space, still remain powerful operators in modern international legal system. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this ambiguity by talking about one of the first regimes to exist in the global commons, and that is the regime that protects whales. So again, this is from another legal scholar on the global commons, Susan Buck, again describing the global commons and saying, in her example itself is whales. Some objects have no property rights attached to them because they were stray or they could be acquired like whales. They are res nullius objects, but once they're taken into possession by one or more individuals, they become res private. So I want to talk a little bit about how whales themselves kind of changed categories here. And I want to, I guess we've been talking today, this morning we were talking about fugitive property, this idea of property that is moving and the way in which law is tracking that. And I think that if you watch carefully the way law has adapted itself to that, in the law of the global commons, it's very instructive. So I'm going to just read a little bit here about whales. Whales are a great example of what we're talking about with fugitive common property, because their governance in international law is really the first and most famous instance of a global commons regime. It began in 1946 when whales went from res nullius, they were freely hunted by anyone, to res communis under the 1946 International Whaling Commission. This international agreement protected whales as a commercial resource with quotas and various other restrictions on industrial fleets used in their capture. But by 1962, whale harvesting reached its peak with a recorded total intake of 62,000 great whales. By the 1970s, the whale population crashed, and the experiment in global commons resource management was over. In 1982, the International Whaling Convention called for a moratorium on whale killing, and that moratorium is still in effect. Only Japan and Norway have not signed on to this. So there's a provision in the moratorium also for indigenous peoples whose traditional forms of life are sustained by whale hunting. So what does this show us? As it turns out, the concept of a moratorium, not the concept of res communis, not the concept of common property, has been the best legal form for thinking about whales as commons. And why is that? Well, advances in underwater photography, I would argue, brought whales into the consciousness of a large group of citizens when, for the first time in 1976, Jim Udall photographed live whales off the coast near Maui. Then on April 2nd, 1978, the noted CBS News reporter Walter Cronkite cited a number of special traits which appeared to place whales and their cetacean cousins, dolphins and porpoises, within what he called a different moral category than other animals. Cronkite commented that there was something in humanity's ethical development, quote, that is done violence to when men kill, without compunction, intelligent creatures, which a growing number of people consider almost human, unquote. In this period then, popular culture took these giant mammals out of the category of scientifically identifiable species and placed them in a very fuzzy category, somewhere between fish, teddy bear, human, something like that. So what does this case of the first global commons tell us about the legal discourse of commons? First, it tells us that what was considered bare life, and I'm using this term by Giorgio Agamben, of this idea of life that doesn't have any kind of legal protection, this something that was in the status of bare life, res nullius, whale, was not removed when it was placed by the International Whaling Convention in the legal category of res communis. The res nullius whale, in fact, had to be removed from the res communis category in order to be protected. A moratorium, after all, is not a legal definition of commons. According, generally speaking, this is one definition from the Oxford English Dictionary of a moratorium is, quote, a legal authorization to a debtor to postpone payment for a certain time. So if you look at Save the Whale websites and loyally friends of the whales, they're actually hoping that this moratorium will simply become permanent. So what's being permanently delayed in this new legal category? Quite simply, I'd say what's being delayed is a determination about what kind of life this whale represents. Back from the living death of res nullius, which was only prolonged in its status of a res communis resource, the whale finds itself in a new legal community created by lawmakers who can no longer rely upon scientists to say what kind of race, what kind of thing it is. It's no longer either res nullius or res communis. The whale appears to go back to something like the old Roman category of res divini iuris, things belonging to the gods, only now it's in a mobile sanctuary created by a moratorium. And then this is perhaps the most successful global commons to date. So, how does the example of the whale extend the discourse of commons in modernity? I would argue that our commons vocabulary, again, the global commons vocabulary, is extended first of all because the whale contributes a limit concept to the authority of science in global jurisdictions. The moratorium on whaling helped to create a new comfort zone in ontological uncertainty, which leads to the precautionary principle, an important tool in crafting environmental law. The current whaling convention also shows us how new visualizing technologies can add to our image repertoire of the world around us, and how those images can gain rhetorical leverage in a legal system that has no category to recognize its validity. And finally, the history of the international laws on whaling expand our thinking about commons domains by showing what can happen when law stretches its conceptual framework around a space that migrates. So if I had more time, I would give you other examples that I had from the book, from international law, showing how it gets rid of empty space or res nullius when it has to protect commons or create new ideas of commons. Just very briefly, outer space law, which was a really, I looked at the first couple years of legal conventions that met after Sputnik went up in 1957, where jurists were debating and trying to carve out a law of outer space. And they basically were extending the law of the seas into outer space, but there were really very interesting kinds of discussions about what kind of space it was. Well, just to give you one example of the difficulty, of course, was that this space moves. The space moves, and so you can't simply extend the law of the seas up with these three zones of the contiguous 12-mile limit, the economic zone, the second mile, and then the outer zone of the high seas. But in fact, that's what the law of the atmosphere and outer space actually has done. But nevertheless, there are really quirky things about it. For example, when Chernobyl, for example, sent a cloud of radioactive waste across the globe, the Soviet Union paid no liability charges for that. But in 1979, when one of their nuclear satellites crashed in Canada, northern Canada, Cosmos 954, the Soviet Union had to pay Canada $3 million for that. Why? Because it was in the jurisdiction of the law of outer space, covering things that move. And there was a way to attach liability, and it wasn't not using a property rule so much as a rule of liability to bring a remedy for that problem. So, so many people have said, you know, let's for the law for the environment, we can learn from these other domains of commons where the law had to move its property law into beginning to cover things that move. And I did find very interesting examples of that happening, especially in the law of outer space, in the law in the internet law, which is also a domain of the global commons. And then, so in this book, after kind of looking at the global commons and in international law, I asked myself what does it look like in places where this kind of res nullius, this empty space, is actually being revoked in law. And so the last part of the book is two case histories which look at the revocation of terra nullius. And I took the Western Sahara case and the case in Australia with Mabu Islanders. So those two cases where international law and national law had to recognize that there never was terra nullius. Terra nullius was a mistake. It never was there. We have to now we have to bring law to recognize who was the kind of property that land is prior to terra nullius. So the idea that something of that space and its political organization persisted and was still there to be recognized. And in the Western Sahara case, of course, we're talking about, again, idea of territoriality that moves because these are nomadic peoples. And so the case in Western Sahara, which is the last state in Africa to be decolonized, and a state that's still in a state of civil war, not civil war, but is still in a state of war, is a very unsuccessful attempt to recognize to take away terra nullius, because there the solution that the International Court had was what we'll do is we will take a census of the people who are in this area of the Sahrawi, the nomads in this area, and declare that Spain, that this area never was res nullius, terra nullius. Spain doesn't have a claim to it. We will take a census of those people. We will have them vote and then elect the kind of state that they want. And that was in 1976. And to take a census of people, of nomadic peoples, they have for years then had to describe and try to define and argue with the surrounding states who are the peoples that are going to be citizens are going to be able to vote in this census. So this kind of tool for a statist, territorial, kind of stasis of territorial space has been completely unsuccessful because, of course, the Sahrawi migrated into Morocco and into Algeria, and were living there in different times, and there never was a consensus on who would be able to be in that census. And of course, this is also a story about mining, phosphate mining, and various other things that were there, and how that kind of works into the inability of that place to become a state. In the Mabu case, more successfully, once terra nullius was revoked, then the Aboriginal tenure strategy of land, the song lines, was recognized by the state, and so a solution had to be made. One lawyer that I interviewed who worked on a particular case, because these it was for a mining company. He was a lawyer for the mining company, and the way that works is that the song lines are kind of genealogical memory, as are the Sahrawi's land tenure forms. They're kind of what the anthropologist Marilyn Strathern calls biofigural social forms. So they come out of this, out of their genealogical memory. And in the song lines, of course, the state had to recognize these very different forms of space that moves in their legal system. In the case that I looked at, there was negotiation then between several tribes, had claims that their song lines passed through a particular site that had been given to, had been leased to a mining corporation, and that mining corporation decided to profit share with the tribes who are now scattered throughout Australia. So looking at, so what do I gain from trying to look at these places where the persistence of a non-modern, non-terra nullius social identity were recognized by the dominant form? I think that there's a way to use this kind of, this idea of these, the kind of commons that is, the kind of negotiation that demands of us, so that the kinds of, I call it disjunctive commons, so that there's epistemologically diverse, no common denominator for the categories, the cultural categories that are used in a resolution of a problem. So I looked at those two. Cases, and the last thing I want to say about this is that, I worked very theoretically in all of these things, and was really looking at law, in particular looking at the way commons were created out of legal categories. But what I really wanted to do after this was I wanted to kind of work differently as an anthropologist too, and I wanted to try to experiment and try to produce something with what I was, had kind of the conclusions that I had come to in the book about common property and about commons. And so the idea that to begin to look at space, or to look at modern space and urban space as something that with another kind of non-modern belonging to the land that persists within the modern. At the time, I was living in Phoenix, Arizona, and which is a huge kind of post-World War II urban sprawl. And when I was thinking about where commons might be best articulated or visible for people in a place like Phoenix, I thought about right-of-way. So right-of-way is this kind of invisible way of moving through private property and public property, and I wondered if right-of-way could in some way be thought of as a commons. And so Arizona is a state that has serious problems with getting its solar energy going, and so what I did was I created a kind of a demonstration project for solar energy in right-of-way, and the idea was to place the hardware for a solar collector, photovoltaic distributed solar collector in right-of-way with a lease, and to hold the property in a trust, community trust, and to sell the electricity to an adjacent user and have after you pay everything off, the revenue stream itself could be used then in low-income housing. And so I put together this business model and I submitted it to the U.S. Green Building Council meeting that was meeting in Phoenix that year, and it won as the 2009 Legacy project. So I was immediately able to get $200,000, and I went to some architects that I knew, and I said, "You think we could try to build this?" And I want to say the reason that people loved this idea, that people wanted to give money, they were nonprofits who said, this is great to be able to connect low-income housing with energy, with renewable energy. And we've been waiting for some kind of design like this to come around. And I think that the kinds of things you can start to think about in this kind of space, when you look at space differently and use it differently, was really key to trying to design something that was really quite different. And so so we started. I'm going to show you a little bit about what we did with that project then. And again, this is, I want to say first that before that, the reason that there were two key things that I would consider to be, and this is about building local commons now. So this kind of why is right-of-way not empty space? Why is it different than that? And why would you want to hold property for this project in a trust as opposed to some other mechanism, giving it to the state, giving it to the government, or something like that. So I want to talk about those two kinds of mechanisms then. Trust as a strategy for ownership, and right-of-way as a persistence of a non-modern form of commons. So the first project, we thought of putting it on, there was a light rail that was being built in Phoenix, and one of our first designs was, let's just put it on the light rail there. And one of our designers said, let's write right there on the street, your right-of-way, working for you. So, making visible something that's completely invisible in the land, this idea of right-of-way. And again, claiming it as a commons in some sense, by showing that it's not necessarily a state form. So this is one of our first designs. I want to say that also Arizona, what was so important is that also thinking about the sun and sunshine as a commons, our kind of tagline was the sun shines for everyone. So here, just look at the kind of abysmal situation in Arizona with regard to solar energy. Days of sunshine in Arizona, 334, basically they have double what Phoenix has, and far more than even Germany, but you can see the watts of photovoltaic power that are produced annually in these different places. And why is it that Arizona, and the way it uses its sunshine and the way it uses this kind of common good, why is it so behind? Well, there's 3 public utilities in Arizona that control the use, that control electrical production. And even so, distributed solar was just very, very behind because it was very hard to get to start to think about how you could be a solar producer and not be under the jurisdiction of the utility utility commission. So there's a lot of problems in trying to work this out. But Arizona also is a very, is a very libertarian state, and was going to say, for example, one of the things in putting together this design was that the renewable energy standards and credits, that when you go to make a budget for something like this, usually your utility company has a standard. So in Arizona, they wanted to have 15% renewable by 2025. In California, for example, it's 33% by 2020. Well, with this kind of renewable standard, then you could get a credit back into your project, and that would make your budget go down for your project. Unfortunately, the state legislature in Arizona in 2010 was planning on putting nuclear energy and having that count as a renewable energy source. Therefore, there would be no renewable energy credit for our project. So we had to constantly revise our budget, constantly over the last few years, because of all of the changes that were happening in the legislature with, with the credits that we were supposed to come back to the project. All right, so again, I'm thinking about demonstration projects as a kind of field site. And not that I go to a field site and look at it, but rather that the field site is something that I try to build with the ideas that I've been working on and that I've been finding in another field. And using residual, which I'm calling right-of-way, right? Residual cultural and emergent cultural forms, right-of-way and public trust ownership. The attempt is to kind of expand the dominant political economy by counterbalancing and a counter-narrative to exchange value, but also to expand the epistemological repertoire of recursive public spheres. So, creating, and this is so important, I think, going forward with anybody who's going to try to use public trust doctrine or forms of trust for holding property or for protecting property, is to start to think about these trusts as this kind of form as the creation of a new kind of public sphere. And if you have it in this legal form of the trust, it's very easy to recreate it everywhere. So, for example, when we presented this project to Greenbuild, Greenbuild, which has chapters all over the United States, said, hey, couldn't we be the entities that hold the trust, or couldn't we be the trustees for Solar Commons? Couldn't we, raise money and put distributed solar in our city? We would be the trustees, these chapters. We would use this model and reroute the income stream in this way. And so there's many ways you could think of it, quickly becoming a recursive form in this way. So again, rethinking what a local commons could be like. Some of our first designs in this were, really imaginative. We thought we would, try to design the solar panels as this beautiful, object, natural object, and the idea that we were kind of bending technology to suit nature, and really, we were putting this really in central Phoenix, in downtown Phoenix was the original plan, kind of like landing an unidentified socialist object in the middle of Phoenix. It seemed like such a great idea. We had the money, to do it and all the backing, and then we started to have problems with insurance. We started to have problems with the utility company who started to fight us, because what we were really suggesting was that people could be their own solar distributors. They could become their own energy producers here, and so we got immediate pushback from that, not being allowed to enter, or rather, being dissuaded from connecting to the grid, which was controlled by these three companies. So. This was another design that we had that it could be put along the freeway, other right-of-way lanes. We designed this kind of particular one. We had all of the economics done for us, so we could see that a 25 kilowatt module that would probably cost about $200,000 and would have approximately a $2,000 return. So we had kind of all of these things. We created a website. I created a website for kind of little inert website, but again, what one does to kind of help create reality is to put it into a website. So we put the plan for architectural plans, we put the business plans and various things up there. So right now, we are building this in Central Phoenix, in an area that is with the Audubon Society land that has been a kind of an area that used to be a huge dump, and it's really one of the poorest areas in Phoenix. So it's a dump site that has been refurbished and has been turned into a reclaimed habitat area for South Phoenix. So again, this is to go back to my title, local and global commons. This is my example then of trying to use ideas that come out of research in this way, of thinking how to think beyond kind of the categories of property categories for common property that have kind of existed in law, and to by starting to look for things that are residual. Whether they're indigenous forms of collective property, whether they are right-of-way forms that persist. Right-of-way, for example, kind of was a category that comes into English law at the time of the enclosures in the 17th century, as these fields, common fields were being enclosed, villagers, peasants needed ways to walk through them in order to get to relatives and others on the other side of the field. And so this is kind of the beginning of a right of way. And of course, right of way in England is very different than the United States. There's pathways all over. In the 1970s, right of way became something of a movement in England to reclaim this kind of public space. So thinking of how that could work in the United States was a key way to try to think of design, and then to examine the way, the problems that I was having in getting this built became kind of a research project of trying to understand how and why commons were having such a hard time getting built. Again, in the right-of-way in Phoenix, only state entities and only the government and the market entities were using right-of-way. There were no community or nonprofit forms in right-of-way. And so that was new. So again, using trust, and trust, again, as a form that holds property, common property, for future generations. The trust model is basically a kind of holding mechanism that allows you to hold something on behalf of somebody else. And so, again, to hold something for future generations or for low-income housing or something else, but that you can create a trust document that mandates exactly where things should go. And part of my title was Emergent Institutions in Commons. And I think that one of the key things in building local commons, given the kind of common property issues that we have, is the creation of institutions. If you think about market, state, and commons as sectors, different sectors, you have very well-developed institutions in the market sector, well-developed institutions in the government sector, courts, etc. But in the common sector, we're left with very few recognizable and useful institutions. So part of what this project was trying to do was to show and develop a kind of institution for the commons, and to help that use the kind of existing law to do that. I've often thought about this as kind of like the granaries that were put up to kind of solve across the Midwest at the turn of the last century, a problem that was developing with the organization and distribution of grain, that similarly these kinds of structures would become visible along right-of-way throughout the United States, and would have that kind of historical value that we were kind of recreating these kinds of cooperative commons. Finally, I just want to end with this idea of Lawrence Rosen, legal anthropologist who said that law transmutes fictional to justiciable reality. Even though it's hard to pronounce, justiciable, the idea that, that we are moving between imaginal forms that and kind of moving these things into something that is protected and we can use current legal structures for. And I think that global commons require, the invention of local global commons too requires a great acts of imagination as well as institutions and law to protect and back them up. So thank you very much.